Welcome to the Lost Method, where history is explained through the systems that shaped it. For most of the 19th century, Britain and the United States were not allies. They were rivals. Not symbolic rivals, not friendly competitors, real rivals, with competing interests, competing empires, and a long memory of war. In fact, if you were living in the 1800s, the idea that Britain and America would one day fight side by side in two world wars would sound almost absurd. So what changed? How did two nations that fought a revolution, fought again in 1812, and came dangerously close to war multiple times, end up becoming the most influential alliance in modern history? The answer isn't a single treaty. It isn't a single speech, and it definitely isn't a sudden moment of friendship. It's a story of power, economics, fear, and a slow realization that conflict between them was becoming less useful and more dangerous. This is how Britain and America went from rivals to allies. The story begins with a breakup. The American Revolution wasn't just a war for independence. It was a direct challenge to the British Empire, the most powerful system on Earth at the time. Britain didn't simply lose territory, it lost authority. And after 1783, the relationship between Britain and the new United States wasn't calm. It was tense. Britain still had colonies in Canada, it still dominated the seas, and it still viewed America as a former possession that might not survive. Meanwhile, the United States didn't see Britain as a distant empire. It saw Britain as a threat that could return. Even after independence, the idea of another war was never far away. And then, in 1812, it happened. The War of 1812 is often forgotten today, but at the time, it mattered. The United States fought Britain again over maritime rights, trade restrictions, and British support for Native American resistance. And Britain, already fighting Napoleon in Europe, still managed to burn Washington, D.C. That war ended without a clear winner, but it left behind something important: a mutual understanding that war between them was possible and costly. Yet peace didn't mean friendship, because in the decades that followed, Britain and America didn't unite, they expanded, and their expansion brought them into direct collision. By the mid-1800s, Britain was a global empire. It controlled key trade routes, it ruled India, it had colonies across Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean, and it enforced its dominance with the Royal Navy. The United States, meanwhile, was growing across North America at speed. It was industrializing, it was expanding west, and it was beginning to see itself not as a small republic, but as a future power. This created friction everywhere: border tensions with Canada, naval competition, trade disputes, competing influence in the Americas, and in many moments, it almost turned into war. But one moment in particular brought them terrifyingly close. In 1861, America was tearing itself apart in the Civil War, and Britain watched closely. Because Britain had interests, and Britain had options. A divided United States would be weaker, a fractured America would be easier to contain, and British industry depended heavily on Southern cotton. So in Washington, people feared something, that Britain might intervene. Then came the Trent Affair. A Union warship stopped a British mail ship and seized Confederate diplomats. In Britain, outrage exploded. Troops were moved toward Canada. The Royal Navy prepared. War plans were discussed. For a moment, it looked like Britain and America were heading into another conflict, right in the middle of America's Civil War. And here's the key point. Britain could have pushed it. Britain could have escalated, but it didn't. Because Britain began to realize something that would shape the future. A war with the United States would not be clean. It would not be quick. It might not be winnable in the long term. Britain backed down. The United States backed down, and the crisis passed. But the lesson remained. After the Civil War, something subtle changed. Britain was still powerful, but the world was changing faster than Britain's empire could adapt. The United States was industrializing rapidly. Its population was exploding, its economy was expanding, and crucially, America was becoming a naval power. This didn't mean Britain suddenly loved America. It meant Britain began to calculate, and Britain's calculation was shaped by a new problem: Europe. By the late 1800s, Britain faced rising threats closer to home. Germany was unifying, its industry was growing, its military was expanding. France still existed as a rival. Russia was expanding across Asia. Britain's empire was massive, but overstretched. And when you are overstretched, you can't afford unnecessary enemies. So Britain began to reduce conflict where it could, and America was the easiest conflict to reduce. By the 1890s, Britain and America began a slow process of improved relations. Historians call this the Great Rapprochement. It wasn't announced, it wasn't celebrated, it just happened. Britain made compromises on border disputes. The United States eased tensions. Trade increased. Diplomatic coordination became more common. The relationship shifted from hostility to practicality. And then, a major test arrived. In 1895, the United States invoked the Monroe Doctrine during a dispute between Venezuela and British Guyana. America basically told Britain, stay out of the Western Hemisphere. This could have become a serious confrontation. Britain could have ignored it. It had the world's strongest navy. It had global influence. But Britain didn't escalate. Why? Because Britain's priorities were changing. Germany was becoming the real threat, and Britain didn't want a conflict with America while a stronger rival was rising in Europe. So Britain chose diplomacy. This is one of the most important moments in the story. Britain didn't back down because it was weak. It backed down because fighting America no longer made sense. That is how alliances begin, not with friendship, with strategy. As the 20th century approached, the economic relationship deepened. America became a major industrial producer. Britain remained a global financial center. Their economies were different, but complementary. War between them would destroy trade, investment, and stability. And as the world became more interconnected, the cost of conflict increased. This is a pattern you see repeatedly in history. When economies intertwine, rivalry becomes expensive. Not impossible, but expensive. When World War I broke out in 1914, the United States did not immediately join Britain. America stayed neutral. But neutrality did not mean equal distance. American trade and finance increasingly supported Britain and France. Germany's actions, especially unrestricted submarine warfare, pushed America closer to intervention. By 1917, the United States entered the war. And this mattered for one reason. For the first time, Britain and America fought on the same side in a global conflict. Not as former enemies, not as rivals, but as partners. And once you fight together in a war of survival, your relationship changes permanently. So, what's the real answer? How did Britain and America go from rivals to allies? Because they both learned the same truth, at different times. Their rivalry was becoming pointless. For Britain, America was no longer the main threat. Germany was. For America, Britain was no longer the empire it had to defeat. It was a useful partner in a dangerous world. And the 20th century would prove that point again and again. World War II, the Cold War, NATO, global trade. The alliance wasn't built on affection. It was built on shared interests. And that's the most important lesson. This story reveals something deeper about how history actually works. Great powers don't stop fighting because they suddenly become moral. They stop fighting when the cost of conflict becomes too high, the benefits become too low. A new threat changes the equation. Cooperation becomes more profitable than competition. Britain and America didn't become allies overnight. They slowly removed the reasons to fight. They replaced rivalry with alignment. And once the system shifted, the alliance became inevitable. So here's the real question. Did Britain and America become allies because they wanted to, or because the world gave them no other choice?